A fairly hefty Orky Vehicle preview today. The Stompa is dropping in points significantly, the Ramshackle rule has seen a massive buff, we've got a new stat line for the kill rig, and rather unfortunately, Gorka and Gorkanauts seem to be moving to be a Lord of War choice. Let's take a look at what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're here for another Orky preview. Games Workshop really letting quite a lot of new information go in this one. We'll start with the Stompa, then Ramshackle, then the kill rig, then the Gorka and Gorkanauts. So first up, it looks like it's good news for the poor Stompa, which has been depressingly overcosted since the very start of 8th edition. I think if there was one thing that was on Ork players' wish lists for a new codex, then the Stompa dropping heftily in points would certainly have been there. The model's a really cool Ork centerpiece one. At least by Games Workshop standards, for the amount of model you get, it's quite cheap as well, costing far less than an Imperial Knight, while still being a fair bit bigger. But it just really didn't compete all that well on the Lord of War scene. It has an absolute ton of wounds at 40 currently, but no invul save unless you have a custom force field nearby, and after the Imperial Knight codex dropped, the Stompa and the Knights just really didn't match up at all. With a relic or two, Imperial Knights just really weren't all that far behind a Stompa, despite costing 50% cheaper or more. Now though, it does seem that Games Workshop is tossing them a bone, though I must admit they've made it a little bit unclear in the article. It says that they've dropped down 175 points to 675, although to be honest that doesn't really make all that much sense, as Stompas currently have a base cost of 900 points. Not really too sure what they're getting at here. It might mean that they've made a typo and they're actually 725, or maybe their base cost is 675 and they might be able to take 50 points of upgrades or something. In any case, it's a major point slash, and now one will only be around about a third of the cost of your list rather than almost half, and according to their article they'll also be improving in other ways, not specified as of yet. I guess at the very least the new WAR rules might allow them to get either extra AP or extra attacks. It's very hard to imagine that they're not going to be better in the new codex. Lords of War have become a lot easier to include in an army. They only cost you 1 command point if your warlord's the same faction, and if you did want to try and get a clan trait on them, they do have other cheap Lords of War that they can also add in alongside. From the Forge World Imperial Armor Compendium, the kill tank is really quite cheap in points, and is also pretty powerful as well. Maybe it could be a good way to field super heavies, maybe a couple of them and a Stompa, and they all get a clan trait too. In any case, hope they've managed to balance it right. Seeing viable Stompas on the battlefield would be really cool. Next up, and perhaps the single biggest change out of this preview, is the change to the Ramshackle rule. This is the rule that sort of represents Ork vehicles just being welded together with loads of scrap and enthusiasm, often with lots of extra bits that aren't really necessary to the functioning of the vehicle, and representing the chance of a random shot, say just melting a big glyph plate, or some extra random gubbins that doesn't really matter too much. The previous version of it was a rule for the Ork trucks, where basically if you suffered multiple damage, you could roll a d6, and on the roll of a 6, that damage will be reduced to a damage characteristic of 1. I guess in theory it could be really powerful, say if you decreased a high las cannon damage roll all the way down to a 1, but in reality it very rarely came up all that much, and even when it did, sometimes it didn't even matter that much anyway. Converting a single damage 2 shot to a damage 1 shot isn't that big a deal. I believe it only applied to Ork trucks previously as well, and now it's becoming far more generalised. Now it seems that the new version of the Ramshackle rule is almost like a toned down version of Death Guard's Disgustingly Resilient, or Space Marine Dreadnought's Duty Eternal. It's -1 damage every time the vehicle suffers a hit, provided that hit was a strength of 7 or less. It's really going to hit any sort of volume damage 2 fire, whereas really big anti-tank shots such as las cannons and multi-melters and things, they're still going to be firing at full effect. It certainly looks like autocannons might go out of fashion a bit when firing at Ork vehicles, as this will flatly cut their damage output in half. It's a pretty nice buff against them, as they were one of the most efficient weapons at killing light Ork vehicles, and on top of that, this rule is going to be highly relevant against damage to melee weapons as well. Maybe things like Blood Angel's Sanguinary Guard, Sisters of Battle Repentia, or Space Marine Blade Guard veterans. On top of that, this rule has become really generalised now. It now applies to almost all Ork vehicles apparently. Specifically, they've called out things like mech guns, killer cans and trucks that are confirmed to have it. Kind of interesting that mech guns get it, to be honest. They're already really quite cheap and durable for what they do, and it seems pretty likely that battle wagons, death dreads and boggies will also have it, if it is indeed going to be fairly generalised. The only vehicles that the article calls out as not getting it are the Stompa, Gorkanaut and Gorkanaut, which are now all Lord of War choices. In any case, this seems like a pretty significant buff to the durability of Orky vehicles. Now not as easy to gun down with volume low strength fire. I guess ideally you'd either want mass damage 1 fire, or proper heavy duty anti-tank. Next we come to the stat line for the kill rig. We don't know any of its weapon profiles yet, but having the stat line is interesting still. And I'm guessing from the amount of wounds it's likely to be a heavy support choice. I was guessing that it was going to be a Lord of War before, just because it looks so big and impressive. In any case, it has a movement of 12, weapon skill 3+, ballistic skill 5+, strength 6, toughness 8, 16 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3+ save. Mostly fairly expected there. I guess the weapon skill of 3+ is pretty helpful, and toughness 8 and 16 wounds should at least mean it needs a fair bit of focus fire to bring down. Unless it's got extra rules for surviving enemy shooting though, it does look like it will be at least relatively easy to focus down if you are charging it straight towards the enemy, as I'm sure is the intention. Interesting to see that it also degrades in its strength as well. Its strength drops to 4 on its lowest profile, so it seems like it could be quite a dangerous melee threat to start with, and then become gradually more of a shooting platform as it takes more and more damage. We also do know the names of a few of its weapons now. That enormous demolisher cannon-like gun is called a heavy lobber. The harpoon launcher is a sticker cannon. We already know about the weird boy mounted whir tower at the back, and it will be getting some nice profiles for all the various combat weapons you can see on it. The beast snaggers with the chainswords are called butcher boys, the squig attacks with its savage horns, and it gets a damage profile for those saw blades that are mounted on its side as well. The article also heavily implied that the kill rig itself would get a bit of transport capacity. I know they said that the hunter rig would get a transport capacity. I guess it's helpful to know that this will too. I'm going to guess that this is going to be more of the dedicated gun platform though, with a higher emphasis on damage. Obviously we'll need to know the points before we know how efficient it is. It will be quite good if they were fairly strong though. It is a really fun model. Finally we have some perhaps slightly worse news for the Ork Gorkanauts, because much like the Necron monolith, it seems that Games Workshop has both decided to buff their stats and also make them a Lord of War choice. Being a Lord of War just really isn't the best news for them, to be honest. It'll mean that you're paying extra command points if you want to run them in your army, 1 command point to run 1 of them, and in particular you're really not incentivized to run 2 of them, so it's usually going to be the choice between 1 or 3. For people who do have multiples of these, it's not really the best. 3 of them in a super heavy detachment is a massive investment at 6 CP, and it's going to significantly alter what you can do in terms of the options elsewhere in the list. I guess Games Workshop is making these into more like mini knight equivalents now. Much like Imperial Knights, they're going to be going to 24 wounds, and the Claw of Gork or the Claw of Mork does a flat 6 damage. We also know that Gorkanaut's Deathstorm shooter is going to get a whole ton more shots as well. It's now going to be 20 or 30, depending on if you're within half range. Overall, I'm not all that hopeful for these guys being any good after the Codex update. To overcome being a Lord of War, they're going to have to be ridiculously efficient, and just bring an enormous amount of damage and survivability to the table for how many points they cost. Otherwise the command point and army construction tax just likely won't be worth it. Overall though, I think it's largely good news for Ork vehicles. I'll definitely be interested to see the full rules on the Stompa and the kill rig once we get them, and I'll be doing a full review of the Ork Codex on the channel when it drops, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see that. If you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page down in the video description below. It is what allows me to make quite so many videos quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos earlier, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.